We've got Peter joining us with 20 years of experience in environmental monitoring and assessment, particularly as an aquatic ecosystem expert. And a lot of Peter's research has looked at the relationship of vegetation to waterway health. So Peter's currently with the GHD Aquatic Sciences Group, so consultancy, and he's managed a range of projects, including field-based monitoring projects, both biotic and abiotic components, as well as environmental risk assessments, management plans, and impact assessments. So some of that has been in sort of primary research and as well as consultancy. So a wealth of information that we're lucky enough to have access to today. Thanks very much, Peter Lind.
Thanks, Alex. Pressure's on now. I'll just start. We hesitate to use the term expert. We tend to use the word specialist, and that's even a stretch at times, but we'll see how we go. Thanks for having me, everyone. I met some of you guys last night briefly, so it's really good to know that you know, there's some passionate people in the hills that want to look after things, and I am one of those said people as well. I am a local. I live in Tacoma. I grew up just off the Devil's Elbow in Upper Ferntree Gully. Did my uni degree down in Deakin in Warrnambool. I was down there for about 15 years, and I think I'm about 15 years since I've moved back. So yeah, it's good to see people in the hills passionate about these things. I'll get straight into it. So can you guys see faces in front of these photos? If I move that there. Anyway, would just like to start by acknowledging and paying respect to the Wurundjeri people, traditional custodians of the land of which many of us are gathered, or at least considering today. I'd like to pay respect to the elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. Now it's timely, we had a meeting during the week where someone actually asked the question, in a good way, why do we acknowledge our traditional custodians? And it was a difficult question to answer without repeating everything that's written there, but it is all about paying respect. And we have a lot to learn as well. And this photo, a lot of what I'm going to talk about isn't specific to this area, but it just highlights some of the things we consider when working on waterways. This is on the Anglesea River in the very upper reaches, and we did a flow study on this system, all about managing flows for the best ecological outcomes. We knew this pool was there. The upper reaches were dry at the time, but we knew this pool, which is groundwater fed, would still be there. So we got up there, we found it. We're all excited about it and what we could use the water for, etc. And we had a traditional custodian with us, and she was talking about the values that they hold with their waterways. And we got all sciencey about this, and she just said to us, Melinda was her name, she said, yeah, we call this forever water because it's always there. It's a known water supply. They could always go there and have a guaranteed source of fresh water. They knew that animals would gather there. It became a regular hunting ground during drought periods. So it was just interesting hearing those different points of view. So that was one of the values they have. So when we think about a waterway, I stole the next couple of slides from another presentation, so they've got a real international feel to them. But when we think about a waterway, what is the value that holds to us? Now, it might differ amongst the people in this meeting. It can differ depending on your job, all sorts of points of view. So the top row there is just a few photos showing that there's some recreational value to waterways. Okay, it might be fishing, kayaking, and this fisherman might not care about water quality or the vegetation on the river. He just wants to catch a fish. So he has a different point of view. There's economic values to waterways, such as irrigation water and stock supply, or hydroelectric dams and farm dams. There's also a social aspect to a waterway and the cultural and heritage values. This is Lake Conda out in Western Victoria, one of the Indigenous fish traps that they built. It's estimated to be, I think, at least 40,000 years old, maybe even up to 60,000 years old. So there's a whole range of values. The most important one to me, I've jumped ahead, look at that. How did I do that? Thank you's a bit early to be saying thank you. Sorry, it was bound to happen. Okay, so the most important one to me, or the one that I deal with most of the time, is the ecological and biological values. So it's not just the fish and invertebrates that live in the river. We're talking amphibians and birds, terrestrial animals and vegetation. They all interact with our waterways. And if you maintain a waterway ecologically in good health, then all of those other values tend to be supported as well. So this is one of the reasons I'm dealing with the ecology side of things. You've heard all about me already, so I'm an aquatic ecologist. I wasn't sure if there was going to be young kids in this call, so I've really spelt out exactly what an aquatic ecologist does. This is one of the Hattar lakes up north, where we did a study looking at what happens with flooding. We work for a whole heap of different people. Again, I don't want to make it sound like I'm advertising my company. I'm just talking about who I am, but you will notice there's a GHD emblem on all these slides. That's because I stole our template to prepare this book. I can't delete that. So I'm not trying to advertise, we're just stuck with that. This is Laura, one of my colleagues. This is the Seaford wetlands where we monitor mosquitoes on behalf of Melbourne Water. Just another little fun fact there. So as I said, I was working out in Warrnambool for the first part of my career. I spent 10 years at Beacon. A lot of the waterways I was working on were in these agricultural landscapes. And you can see the type of impacts that occur when you don't have that vegetation around the waterways. The banks are all eroded, stock access, etc. This is where I really got interested in plants and the association with waterways. When I came here to Tacoma and got my place, it was all about native plants for me. That's how I ended up in Dandenong's community nursery, and that's how I ended up here today. I can't remember, Garrick, if I volunteered or was asked, but either way, happy to be here. Even though the ones on the right here have got good vegetation on their banks and the ones on the left here don't, that's not the only reason these waterways are different. These are lowland rivers. At the bottom of our hills on floodplain areas, they're upland rivers. And Sassafras Creek is an upland river. And I'll talk about that a bit more as I move ahead. So yeah, a couple of things I just wanted to make people aware of when you're thinking about waters, not just all the values associated with them, but they actually work in 4 dimensions. Those dimensions being the obvious one, it flows from the top to the bottom, that longitudinal scale there. On the right here, we've got a floodplain that's inundated. So that's the lateral dimension that we have. So, and that's very important for the health of river red gums and bringing in organic matter for waterways, etc. There's also the water that flows underneath the bottom of a stream. So even though this is wet, there's still water in the substrate working its way through. That can have big effects on all sorts of water chemistry and bugs that live in there. So that's just another dimension. The 4th dimension, which I don't have a photo of, is that interaction between the atmosphere and water, evaporation, direct rainfall, temperature, etc. So there's 4 dimensions to a waterway. You could even argue it's 5-dimensional when you start to consider time and how things change throughout the seasons. The other thing I wanted to point out was what I just mentioned, those differences between upland and lowland streams. Now, this is a bit busy, this slide, but if you look at the photos, they're both of the Yarra River. I believe this is Yarra River. If not, it's one of the tributaries in the upper reaches. So we're talking up above the upper Yarra Reservoir east of Warburton there. It's quite easy to see there's, except for all the buildings within Melbourne, there's a lot of differences between the river in the upland area and the lowland area. So one of the ways we allocate a river system to its area is by giving it an order. So first order streams are those headwater streams. They're usually up in mountainous areas. They have steeper slopes, which means the water velocity is faster, which means the substrate is larger because all the silt, etc., gets away. When you've got two first order streams that converge, it turns into a second order stream, etc., etc. When we get down to the bottom, it's a higher order stream. It might be fourth, fifth, or sixth order. And these streams are more, your lowland waters with the floodplain associated with them. Now, because of the differences in those physical components, the ecology of the stream varies from the top as well. So this picture on the right here, it's from a very famous paper, 1980 now, so it's getting on a bit now. It's not perfect, but it gives a good conceptual model of the changes that occur from a first order upland stream like Sassafras Creek to the big wide river such as the end of the Yarra River. It's in these headwater streams where the contribution of organic matter from your vegetation drives the energy in that system. So like a plant that needs sunlight to photosynthesize, our streams need energy as well. And in those upland areas, the majority of that comes from the catchment. Once you get down to this bottom area, we have algae within the water column, and that's the primary producer which sparks off or starts the food chain. So I hope that makes sense. So because in these upland areas, we're getting lots of leaf litter fall in, we're getting lots of woody debris and snags, which is all important habitat. The next level in the food chain are our invertebrates, our insects and our snails, etc. The ones that specialise in the upland streams are the ones that consume that organic matter. So they're known as shredders. So they'll shred apart leaves and consume it or graze on the rocks. And I'll talk more about them a bit later, but what I'm trying to do here is just demonstrate the importance of the vegetation, which I think is the whole objective of these talks, and how it contributes to the headwaters. And we wouldn't have an aquatic ecosystem if it wasn't for that vegetation. Or, and again, I'll talk about this later, the ecosystem will change in the way it behaves if we lose all this vegetation. These are just some other charts that pretty much say the same thing. They're hard to see because it was an old paper, but this is just re-emphasising what I just mentioned. The matter that comes in from the catchment in the headwater stream is called, I stumble on big words all the time, allochthonous matter, whereas down at the bottom end where we've got our algae, etc., it's autochthonous. So a couple of big sciencey words there, but again, I'm just trying to indicate that that leaf, litter, etc., is just so important to an upland waterway. I mentioned prepared the flyer about this talk before I actually prepared the presentation. If I didn't mention it, that's what happens. So whether I address everything that was in the flyer or not, I'm not sure, but we'll see how we go. Originally, I was going to have a section on how do we monitor waterway health, but it's ended up overlapping with some other case studies, etc. But one thing I often do when I'm asked what do we need to monitor, I just break it down into these three main components. It's like, well, what's the physical thing? Is it land or lowland? Because there's differences in those waterways. Is there barriers such as weirs or dams? You know, do we have a lot of erosion? So it's all those physical components that we start to think about. Then there's the chemical and other contaminants that we also think about. And chemical might be pollution, but it might also be the in-stream processes which help cycle nutrients and other things. So some are natural, some are unnatural. And then of course there's all the little critters and bugs, etc. that live. So rivers are four-dimensional, and there's a lot to think about when you want to assess the overall health of a river. That's towards the end of the Maribyrnong River, not the nicest or natural system I've ever been to, which is obvious from the photo. So all of those different components of a system that need to be considered, it's well recognised in our field of work, and there is this technique for assessing waterway health. It's called the index of stream condition. It's fairly rapid and coarse in some ways, but it does give a good overall view of the waterway health of a waterway. And you can see that there's 5 different categories that they assess for an overall score. Hydrology is the big one. Physical form is habitat and banks. Streamside zone, so that's all of our vegetation. What's living within the rivers. And I'll touch on a bit of this further. There's that ISC assessment is done across the state. It was last done in 2010. Not every single waterway gets assessed. These are the latest results. And there was a reach on Warriallic and Cockatoo Creek that were done in the benchmark, they called it. They both came out as very poor health overall. Okay, and these are the individual scores here for each of the components. So I don't know enough about these waterways, but they've both got a 1 out of 10 for hydrology. Maybe there's some water that gets extracted for agriculture or other uses. Maybe there's some weirs. I don't know. Physical form, 6 and 5 out of 10, some issues there. Good scores for streamside zone. So this is all our vegetation along the edges. Water quality, not the best. They didn't do the aquatic life component, but the overall score is weighted to give a result. So unfortunately, it's very poor for those 2 waterways based on the ISC. You'll notice there's very few. This is the Yarra catchment here that I've zoomed into. I think there's only 1 site that had an excellent condition, and that was on the O'Shanassy River upstream of the reservoir there. Even in the Upper Yarra Reservoir, above the reservoir where it's a closed catchment and our water supply comes from there, it was only in a moderate condition. I don't have the results to be able to say why, but it's clear to see that a lot of our waterways are facing some issues at the moment. So one of the components was hydrology, very important. I think I read it was the maestro of an aquatic system. It has that much influence on waterway health. Australia is very unique compared to other countries around the world. We really live in a land of boom and bust. We'll have zero flows for long periods, or like the last week or 2, we'll have record floods. So to see these floodwaters or to play cricket in the middle of the Darling River, even though it's a natural event, you know, there's some challenges in the future. This was a waterway out west near the Plenty River that we went to monitor one day. It was the easiest work ever because there was a dog, no fish, etc. Why is Australia so boom and bust? What's it all about? Well, again, this is a fairly old bit of information, but average annual drainage for the Murray-Darling Basin is 370 metre cubes per second. That's a lot of water, but when you compare that to the Mekong, which is 17,000, we have a fraction of the water as other countries did. The length of the Murray-Darling, the drainage area, the catchment for the Murray-Darling is bigger than it is for the Mekong, but we're still just getting a tiny fraction of the flow. And in part, that's because of the rainfall that we get here in Australia. It falls at the wrong times, large amounts sometime, not many other times. But in a natural system, a natural river system, our ecology is adapted to that way of life. So it's not a bad thing. When we start to divert water and build dams, and I'm not here to convince people about climate change and what causes it, but all the data we look at is telling us that our rainfall, river levels are decreasing. That's going to present some challenges in the future. This one is this is Darwin rainfall. They have a very wet season, whereas down at Scoresby, we have rain all season. So we've also got differences north and south in Australia in the way our rivers flow. Again, this is just demonstrating how intermittent our rivers are, in that they have periods of cease to flow. Quite simply, the bars on the left are small rivers, on the right, big rivers. Red means they stop flowing for some part of the year. This is Australia. This is France and the UK, the USA, and these are global averages. We have a lot of red. Our rivers stop flowing naturally a lot of the time. So what about Sassafras Creek? There's no gauging station on Sassafras Creek, so I don't know what flow occurs there. And I'm assuming it's got a high level of groundwater dependence. A lot of groundwater flows in as well as surface water flows. I'm sure someone knows that information more than me. The closest gauging station was on Warrigallock Creek at Monbulk. This is the flow that's occurred over the last 20 years. What does it tell us? It tells us winter, we have higher flows, summer, we have low flows. There's periods of cease to flow, and then we get these big flood events every now and again. I won't go too much into this, but this is essentially saying, this is percentage of time. About 95% of the time, our flow is less than 1 cubic metre per second, which equates to 1,000 litres per second. Again, it sounds like a lot of water. It isn't when you compare it to overseas, but 95% of the time we have very low flow, and it's only 5% of the time when we're seeing those flooding flows. We're only going to see these big flows, you know, a flow greater than 30 cubic metres a second every 100 years, whereas all of these low flows we're seeing just every year. I won't go too much into that. This is the one I wanted to get to. 0 represents mean flow in Warrigallock Creek. Red means flow is less than the average. Blue, it's higher than the average. There's more red on this chart than there is blue since 1999. So we had the millennial drought through this period. Clearly we had low flows, but even in the last few years, flow in Warrigallock has been below average a lot of the time. So again, there might be some challenges moving ahead with water availability. Why is flow so important? A flow regime is made up of a whole heap of what we call flow components. We can have our low flows, which might happen most of the year. Then we can have overbank flows, where the flow increases and we flood a floodplain. That wouldn't happen in Sassafras Creek because it's an upland stream without the floodplain, but in a lowland river, yes, we can get these overbank flows. And each of these different flow components play a really critical role in how the system functions. Even a cease to flow event that happen naturally in Australia do, you know, provide a function to our waterways. So we want to maintain as many of these components as we want, because if we lose one of these, it can have dire consequences. And the little critter that I always go back to demonstrate this is the Australian grayling. Great native fish, rare and threatened. It's listed under the EPBC Act, if that means anything to anyone, which is our National Threatened Fauna Act. It's also listed under the state FFG, Flora and Fauna Guarantee Act. It's catadromous, which means it migrates. So the adults live up in fresh water and they migrate down to near the estuary to breed. They only migrate if they get a high flow between April and May. That triggers them to undertake their migration. They'll go down to the estuary, they'll breed, the juveniles get washed out to sea. I think about 6 to 8 months, the juveniles come back and return to upper reaches. But again, they need to be cued by those high flows. If we don't have those high flows, they don't undertake their migration. And this fish only spawns once or twice in its whole lifetime, and they only live for 3 to 4 years. So if we have, say, a 5-year drought and don't get any of these high flows, there's a risk of losing the entire population of this species in a river system. Might not be drought, it might be other issues that are losing that high flow, like a reservoir or water management that doesn't consider the requirements of the fish. Another issue for this fish is barriers to migration. This is Dights Falls in Abbotsford. They can't swim up and over this. There's been literally millions of dollars invested to build a fishway, which allows them to migrate around the barrier and get upstream or downstream as required. So fishways are great. They're a remarkable bit of engineering. The other thing I'll mention about this one is we did a study on another creek. Study's still active, so I'll just call it another creek in the southeast. Big housing development, housing estates are being built either side of the creek. This species is known to live within the creek, and we were asked, what's the implications of the housing developments? Are these guys still going to survive? We modelled, well, I didn't model, but colleagues of mine modelled what would happen to changes in flow. And what we found was the same amount of runoff is going to reach the creek, but it's going to reach the creek quicker because we've got more footpaths, roads, impervious surfaces. So the runoff reaches the creek faster. That means our high flow, the rate that it rises is faster and the rate that it decreases or falls is faster as well. And the Arthur Eiler Institute has done some great research on these guys, and they found that that rate of rise and fall is important for them as well. If the flood decreases too quickly, it's almost like this fish says, oh, we've got the flood, but it's disappearing quickly, let's not bother migrating. So even just subtle differences in our catchment through urbanisation can change our flow regimes and have subsequent impacts. How am I going for time? I see a question there. Should we touch on a question? Hopefully it's not you're muted, Peter, or something like that.
No. I can't actually see a question in. Oh, there it is. Is there any plan of building a fish ladder at the small weir near Beagley's? Not that I know of.
That's a very good question. I don't know if there is or isn't. And I think you've just answered a question that I was going to ask in one of the upcoming slides.
There you go.
Was there a second question there now? I can't see the questions.
No, that's I was sort of wondering actually about sycamore maples with the litter impulse and what that would mean for the nutrient of the creek when they drop their leaves in autumn.
Yeah, this is where I demonstrate my lack of knowledge on vegetation. So I assume that's a introduced species.
Yes, a deciduous introduced species.
Yeah, I know that we have big issues with willows for that same problem. Because our trees drop leaves all year round, there's no sudden build-up of all that organic matter. When you do get that sudden build-up, it's at times too much for the system and as it gets broken down, it can drain all the oxygen out of the water, which I'll mention black water quickly. The other thing is our insects that live in the water, they're accustomed to eating our native vegetation, the eucalypts, etc. They don't like these exotic leaves. So yeah, it's not a good thing. And I was going to talk about black water, but I didn't put it in this presentation, but I'll mention it now because it's related to what you just said then. Some of you might have seen, there's been documentaries made of it, or it was certainly in the news about when all those cod died up in the Murrindindi Lakes and Murray River. It's happened as well. I'm currently working on a floodplain project up that way. A big part of the risks is related to blackwater events, and they are a natural occurrence, but our floodplains haven't been flooded as much these days as what they have been in the past, and that means that leaf litter builds up more so than it would have originally or naturally. So when we do get these occasional floods come through, all of that leaf litter gets broken down at once. That causes the oxygen to get sucked out of the water. As the floodplains drain, all that anoxic water ends up back into the river systems, and it's not the only cause of the fish deaths, but it's a big part of it. I'll move along because time is ticking away fastly, and I tend to speak very fast when I'm watching the clock. So streamside vegetation. So this is where I was going to talk about the benefits of streamside veg. I reckon there's some people in this call that have more knowledge about me, but I've just put a few dot points down there about how vegetation can help maintain a water system. Shading, oh, that doesn't even say shading. Your vegetation can trap sediments coming across from the land, stop our waterways being turbid. They can take up nutrients and other contaminants, especially when the trees are young, stabilise our bank. There's shading, reduces water temperature. Organic matter inputs, we now know how important that is to a headwater stream. Biodiversity, wildlife corridors, not just for aquatic, but terrestrial animals as well. And it contributes to a wide range of values. So it looks good aesthetically, but it also has important functions for our waterways. This is Tumut Creek out Pakenham Way. Many years ago, this might have been a concrete drain, but it's now recognised that's not the best way to manage a waterway, even in an urban environment. So they're now trying to do a bit of that revegetation when we've got these urban waterways. Again, this is the Upper Yarra, that one there. Don't worry about that. Just trying to demonstrate it's lots of dimensions that a river works with, and it interacts with the vegetation in all sorts of ways. And when you don't have the vegetation, you start to see things like this. Severe bank erosion. This is just down the road. This is agricultural lowland stream. You know, you don't need me to tell you that doesn't look real good. This is the Glenelg River in Western Victoria. They have a big issue with sand filling up the river channel. It's not just from the banks that this sand comes from. This can come from hundreds of metres away from the water, even kilometres, but it still gets transported in. Our rivers are the low points that everything ends up in. And this is Reedy Lake out near Barwon Way. Doesn't naturally have a lot of vegetation around it, but I just wanted to put in a photo of a significant algal bloom. So wasn't the most fun day, that one. This is actually the last remaining carp. There were hundreds that we saw die. We think that was the last one. That shows how deep the water is. It was less than the width of a carp. Okay, so how's Sassafras Creek look? Looks pretty good to me as far as vegetation goes. Clearly, it's not 100%. We've got some development around it, but this is one of the sites that we'd fight to go and visit if we were to monitor it. We'd send other people out to the algae-infested areas, usually the younger kids, and we'd go to these nice, pristine areas. And is this the weir that was mentioned earlier? I haven't made it up there because of COVID, and I think that it's closed at the moment because of trees risks.
The track probably is.
Yep. But again, thanks Google, I found some photos. I did find this photo. I had to cover the guy's face. I wasn't sure, who it was, and didn't want to have a photo of him. And then I saw, is this the weir on Sassafras Creek?
Absolutely, it is.
Okay. Wow.
It's right beside the road.
Yeah, okay. Well, that's a significant barrier to fish. Some of our little fish, which I'll get to in a minute, certainly wouldn't be able to climb up there. It's good to have this big pool upstream, but barriers to migration. And it's not just for the migratory fish, it's just to allow fish to exploit resources in the area. That's a big, I won't call it a problem, but that's something that might need to be considered from an ecological point of view. Again, it was built for a reason. It depends what the values of that creek are to you. I don't know why it's there and what it serves or what it used to serve, but it's there for a reason. Who am I to say, take it away? This was done by Meltwater and EnviroDNA. They did a habitat assessment, slightly different to the ISC. They also looked at burrowing potential for platypus, but essentially they said, hey, it's pretty good. It's in excellent condition. Chemical and other contaminants. I'm going to start to rush through these because I am going to run out of time. They can come from point source and non-point source. So point source is like a stormwater drain. You can see where the contaminants are entering. Non-point source is more overland flow. So it might come through a pasture, not through a pipe, and make its way into a river in all sorts of locations. And it's not just chemicals and metals, etc. It might be temperature as well. So this is the Hazelwood, the Lake Hazelwood coal power fire station, I always call it, power station it is. It would discharge its water into the cooling pond. And that water was just, I forget, 30, 40, 50 degrees in temperature, well beyond what was natural. And that's why you could go and catch barramundi in Victoria, in Gippsland. They live up north in tropical waters, but because we're putting warm water into the pondage here, they loved it. So a couple of other examples of contamination. These two on the right are interesting. This was out west. A truck had lost its load off the bridge and it was full of medical supplies and curry powder. So we still monitored the creek and it had a lovely tandoori smell to it. This all gets a bit sciencey here, but again, just demonstrating vegetation in this case works in 4 dimensions. It affects water availability through evapotranspiration, big word. It interacts with the groundwater. It supplies organic matter in, 4 dimensions, and they can use up a large amount of nutrients and filter things and stabilize banks. Yeah. So all this is saying is vegetation is good. We want to keep it. I tried to find some information on the water quality of Sassafras Creek. There's no gauging station, as I said. I couldn't find any water watch data, but this is all available online through DELT, the Water Management Information System. This is Cockatoo Creek at Champions Road. Water level at the top, total nitrogen here. Interestingly, nitrogen follows water level, and that's just showing how a lot of the sources of nitrogen get washed into the rivers during rainfall events. And we only had 1 recording for phosphorus, which was at 0.1 milligrams per litre. What does all that mean? Well, under the EP Act, which has just been updated with a whole heap of new guidelines, to protect aquatic ecosystem health, these are general guidelines. 1.1 for total nitrogen, that's about here. So we're getting levels higher than what the guidelines suggest. 0.06 for phosphorus. The one reading we have is 0.1. So again, looks like we've got some high nutrients coming in. Whether that's natural, because these guidelines are pretty coarse, or whether there's something that requires further investigation, I don't know. And that's what they actually say here is, it doesn't mean there's going to be an impact. It means you might have to look harder. What else did they have? They had pH, how acidic is the water. I think that stayed within the guidelines, a little bit of fluctuation there. Temperature, no surprise, water temperature is higher in summer than it is in winter. Turbidity, the guidelines 25 NTU, often have high turbidity in the waterway, and salinity was pretty good. So we're not getting, by the looks of things, much saline water inputs, etc. Now this is the fun bit, but before I move on, there's some more questions on what we just spoke about there, Alex?
Jenny asked whether there'd be any questions to First Nations people that would help our understanding of the systems, any specific questions? I don't know if you want to put those.
I don't know is the short answer, but it's certainly worth engaging with them and speaking to them and getting them involved. We've got a program at work now where we're making an effort to get some of our traditional owners together in groups and take them down the waterways and show them how to monitor, etc. So, and they're all super keen to help out as well. So for that very reason, you might have some new volunteers just talking to them, but I'm sure they'll have, perhaps I can't speak on their behalf, but I'm sure they might have some different points of view on a few things.
And Eloise added to her earlier question on the weir at Beagley's Bridge, where the creek travels under roads in pipes, there's often a drop off at the lower end. And has there been any thought into working out what you could do about that for fish? Yeah,
that's culverts. Yeah, they're another barrier to fish. It's not just a vertical wall. Some don't like the shading and will avoid swimming through for that reason. Sometimes it is a physical barrier, but there are, and you can go to Melbourne Water website from memory, where there's all sorts of guidelines that are available to give general advice, but even more specific science advice about flow velocities for certain small-bodied fish, etc. So they are recognised as a barrier, and there are ways to manage those.
Thank you.
Cool. So ecology. This is stuff that some people like more than talking about chemistry, etc. This is Zach. He's one of the guys I work with. He's a unit. He has discovered, I think he's up to 14 new species now. Mainly aquatic invertebrates, or the larvae is aquatic and the adults have a terrestrial stage. But yeah, he's going to be a professor down the track. Brown trout, not native. Blackfish, that's from the Upper Yarra Reservoir, and some of our crayfish, and some dodgy river somewhere. So I mentioned earlier that the organic matter into a headwater stream was an important component of the energy that it needs to function. And it's not just our invertebrates and insects that eat the leaves, etc., but algae grows on it. And in particular, algae, there's a Greek term, phyton, for algae, and then periphyton is the attached algae. So algae that lives on top of rocks like this, they live on top of moss, leaf packs in all sorts of places are very important in upland stream. They're the main primary productivity. I told you I stumbled on big words. They drive the food chain. We'll stick with that. But there's other types of algae. This is also an upland stream at the bottom here, but it's very different to our Sassafras Creek. No stream side vegetation, agricultural landscape on both sides with cattle and sheep. There were some market gardens, so there's all sorts of herbicides, pesticides, orthophosphates, cow poo, etc., falling within the landscape, which makes its way into the waterway. No shading, low flows, prime conditions to grow algae. Wasn't much fun there. And I think, so I was involved in a study in the Grampian Ranges, this is a few years ago, where we sampled 19 upland streams, and we were essentially trying to demonstrate the importance of flow in maintaining the algae that lives on rocks. So we're looking for the pathways for recolonisation when a stream starts to flow again. And I won't talk too much about it, but essentially we found, yes, algae need all of these refuges. They need the leaf packs to grow on. They need the rocks. They need little seep areas, etc., to survive during low flow periods. And again, the vegetation surrounding a waterway can help provide the habitat for that algae. When the rivers did start to flow again, we demonstrated that, yes, those algae that hung out in the refuges were now distributed throughout the entire waterways. So that was just telling us, yes, we've got to protect our river during low flow periods to protect our algae because it's important for our food chain. If we have rapid wetting and drying beyond our natural sort of flow regime, that can increase the concentrations of cyanobacteria, or you might know that as blue-green algae. Okay? It's not actually an algae, it's a bacteria. But if we start to change our natural flow regimes, we can also start to impact on our algal species. And then the function of our system starts to fall away a little bit. Our bugs don't like to eat blue-green algae. They prefer the natural algae and diatoms that grow under better conditions. And that's just saying, if your river is in a natural condition, you've got a better chance of a healthy algal community. What happens if we lost all our stream side vegetation? Well, there's a lot of research out there, but I just wanted to touch on the effects of bushfires, because it is unfortunately topical for our areas. This is up in the Murrindindi, sort of after the fires in 2009, I think. And you can see you lose the canopy, you lose your shrubs. There's a little bit of regrowth coming on because it took us a while before we could get in there. But essentially, we were losing all that organic matter input and our algal communities were changing. 1 year after the fire, still all of that energy was coming from the algae within the river, not from the leaves, etc., that under natural circumstances would flow into the river. And it took many years until we started to get a return to more natural conditions. So that it was after the 2009 fire that we did it. There was risks, so we compared burnt and unburnt areas. Sorry, this is a different study. This is going to get really sciencey. So there's carbon, which is the C, there's nitrogen, which is the N. There's actually different types of carbon and different types of nitrogen. So they're isotopes, as they're known. We traced carbon-13 and nitrogen-15 through the food chain. So what we did was we collected leaf matter, we collected algae, we collected our invertebrates and fish, and worked out what type of carbon and nitrogen were within their body tissues. And from that, we were able to tell if their main source of energy originated from algae growing in the stream, or if it originated from the catchment. And again, oh, I've done it again. How did that happen? Sorry, people. Am I running out of time? Am I?
We're at 8:29 p.m.
Okay. Apologies. This stuff quickly then. Invertebrates are the next level in the food chain. They're our snails, our insects, our worms, things without backbones. Why do we monitor them? They're easy to catch in large numbers. They're not as mobile as fish. Easy to identify, a few other points there, but essentially we could go to a river where there was, say, a massive pollution spill last week. If we monitor before and after that pollution spill, we might have missed it. Our water quality is fine, and we say there's nothing wrong with the river. Our invertebrates will take a little bit longer to recover. So even though our water quality might look good, we might find lots of dodgy invertebrates, those that are tolerant to pollution, and all of the ones that are sensitive to pollution have been killed and washed away. So they just add another piece of the puzzle to us. There's some pretty cool photos. They're remarkable animals. These ones are dragonfly larvae. If they were as big as us, they'd be top of the food chain. When you've got a mouth on the end of an arm that can chop a tadpole's head off, yeah, I'm glad they're not as big as us. They're often assigned to different groups based on their feeding habits. So scrapers, grazers eat algae. Shredders, they eat leaves and wood. So we see lots of shredders up in the headland reaches of an upland stream. We measure, when we go and collect all these insects, we've got a few ways of measuring what it tells us. Taxa richness is that if there's more diversity is good. EPT richness, so they're the mayflies, the stoneflies, and the caddisflies. If there's lots of them, that tells us it's good. Signal scores, some of these are more tolerant to pollution than others, so they get a score. If the overall score is high, you can say that the site is in pretty good condition. There's some models we can run it through. We can see if there's flow-loving taxa there, and then we can also do other community analyses as well. This is Oz Rivers, the modelling. This is Australian-wide, but essentially the outputs tell you if your site is better than a reference site, all the way down to extremely impaired. So how does Sassafras Creek look? We had monitored it a few times over the years, so I went and chased out that data and had a quick look. Most recently in autumn 2015, 42 taxas we found in one sample. So this is family level. So anyway, that's pretty high. That's pretty good. 11 of those were mayflies, stoneflies, and caddisflies. So that's a good sign. Had a high signal score. So again, this is all good news. Oz Rivers suggests it was similar to a pristine reference collection. Flow-loving species were there, and there was significant diversity. And we also had a few crayfish, a couple of which were threatened under the state FFG Act. So good news, good news. What happens when you get a drought? You lose your habitat. I'll come back to this if anyone wants to talk more about it, but yeah, droughts are a challenge for our rivers. Our animals can either resist changes to drought, such as, you know, there's even a fish species that hangs out in burrows, crayfish burrows, as water levels dry up. And when it floods again, they'll leave the burrows. So in a drought, even that water that flows underneath the substrate maintains some level of diversity. So when water comes up again, they come back. And there's resilience as well, which is things that can fly, so they can come back once flow starts happening. There was this study I found on Sassafras Creek. It's largely driven by Chris Walsh at Melbourne Uni, who does a lot of work on the effects of urbanisation on streams. But this was actually about the effect of the millennial drought. So what's that, 12 years of data they had? 13 years of data. They sampled Lyrebird, Wallaby and Sassafras Creek. We do have an endangered amphipod. This isn't that endangered species, but you know, it's an amphipod. And in Lyrebird Creek, which did dry up, they lost this endangered species. It didn't come back after 5 years, even though they were not far further upstream where the spring was maintaining water. And it changed the whole makeup of our invertebrate community. Sassafras Creek, it persisted during that period, I believe, and everything lived on happily. I'll come back to this. This is more of Chris Walsh's work. That was the one I couldn't remember why I included it, so I won't talk about it. Fish, just quickly, how do we monitor fish? Well, there's lots of different ways. This is electrofishing. So this is a little battery-powered generator that we carry on our backs. This is a pole, which is the anode. A cable falls out the back, is the cathode. You hit the trigger, the water completes the surface, and you zap the fish. I describe it, I've never been tasered, but I'd say it's like being tasered. It is non-lethal. As soon as you release the trigger, the fish, understandably, swim away. Provided all the settings are right, we can do pretty intensive fish surveys and get a good idea without hurting or without killing any fish at all. Just so happens we had these field cameras set up to capture changes in habitat, and we captured ourselves fishing. So, you can also electrofish out of the boat. So these big arms are in the water. They're the anode. The hull of the boat works as a cathode. There's a generator, zappy zappy. All sorts of different nets we can use as well. And a new technique, I say new, it's maybe over 10 years old now, is we can actually take a water sample, filter that through a very fine filter, get that analysed for eDNA, and see if there's any eDNA of our target species in the actual water. But you don't even have to see a fish in some cases to be able to tell if they are there. What fish do we know from Sassafras Creek? This is a combination of survey results I came across and the Victorian Biodiversity Atlas as well. I did a quick search on there and then consolidated the results. So we've got eels up that way. They might not be right at beaglies, but they're in the system. There's potential for them to be there. Although this little ornate galaxid, this one here, wouldn't get over that weir. That would be a barrier to him getting further upstream. Couple of endangered species. This is the one I mentioned earlier when I was talking about flow. Eastern dwarf galaxids, they're reported from the area, but they wouldn't be in the creek for reasons I won't go into now. Unfortunately, we do have a lot of non-natives, you know, and they're a big issue for our fish. I did put an asterisk next to mosquito fish and the weather loach because they haven't actually been recording from what I found, but I dare say, especially the mosquito fish, they're probably there. The mosquito fish, this one at the top here, we shouldn't call it mosquito fish, so I'll cross that out. We call them ambusia. They were introduced in the 1920s to help control our mosquitoes by eating the larvae in our waterways. Doesn't work. It's the old cane toad story. They mature at 2 months old, can have batches of up to 50 live young 9 times a year. But they're tolerant of all sorts of water conditions and they're aggressive. They eat our frog and fish eggs and peck at their fins. Not a good fish. They're the fish, unfortunately, we see the most of in our Melbourne waterways. This guy, the Oriental weather loach, 1960s, mainly through the aquarium trade, he was introduced. You know, they can tolerate low oxygen by gulping, and high temperatures. They were found in the spring up to 42 degrees. So it's bad having them in our waterways, but when our waterways become even more degraded, these are the species that are going to persist. It's a sad story. I don't know how to get rid of them all. Don't know. Question for someone else. The blackfish, though, good old blackies, they're native in the system. Caught a lot of these. I just put a little bit of information up there, but again, because we're talking about vegetation, they live in wood and boulders. You know, especially adults, they have a preference for one single snag which they'll live under. I've seen in fish surveys I've done in the Upper Yarra River that all the adults live under the, well, rocks and logs. All the juveniles tend to hide under leaf packs. And it's not until they're older that they really establish a nest. So again, we need that leaf input, not just for our algae and invertebrates, but it provides habitat for these fish as well. Spawn in hollow logs. We need the vegetation. A little bit more information there. They have a restricted home range. So again, we used to joke about fishermen going to the river and saying this would be a great fishing spot if we just pulled all the logs out. But the only reason there's fish there is because of those logs. Oh, and then there was a fun fact. I stumbled across the traditional custodian name for them, duat. Couldn't find what duat means, but probably something really fancy. And quickly on platypus, bit of background information there. This is one we found on a mine site up in New South Wales, actually. Good news is they are in Sassafras Creek, Warriella Creek. They are present. They've been found through both trap-in and the eDNA surveys I mentioned earlier. There is a study, it was done actually at Hillsville Sanctuary, where they started to look at the burrows. So these are some of the shapes that the burrows make. Within the burrows, there is, pardon me, a nesting chamber. And they do actually build a nest like a bird. What they found, excuse me, is, I think it's on the next slide. The Lomandra and the poa grasses, that's what they were making the nests out of. They'd actually curl up the Lomandra into the nest shape and then have the poa strands the other way around, holding the nest together. They collected wet material because it helps to maintain the humidity within the nets. Sometimes they use eucalyptus leaves. The main gist of this paper was the vegetation is important for the juveniles to survive. They will use whatever on hand. They have been shown to use willow roots and other exotics, but it just doesn't maintain the humidity and temperature in the burrows as what our native vegetation does. So it's best to have our native species there. There's lots of ways to assess if a burrow is likely to be present. This was done at this site, which is very hard to see because it's so small. I think this is the same one as before. It's saying excellent. Surveys were done. And I'll let you read that quote in italics there, which comes from a well-respected platypus ecologist who I've done some work with and who I spoke to about this. So I think that's a good news story. The other part of the quote I didn't include was, sorry, Pete, I haven't got time to get that information together. But this is what I think. That was good. I like that. So we're coming to the end. Okay. If we look up the top right here, again, this is from some of the Chris Walsh work. done on urbanisation. He's like, look here, we've got Sassafras Creek, clean water, stable channel, diversity, animals, plants, retains nutrients. Here we have Little Stringy Bark Creek. Okay, both waterways have the same level of urbanisation. There's actually more septics and unsealed roads in Sassafras Creek. Why is it that Sassafras is in such a good condition? They go on to say, well, it's the roofs and the pipes connected to streams, roofs and roads connected by pipes. It's that point source inputs of contaminants that is driving a lot of the inferior condition in Little Stringy Bark Creek. It's not the only reason. I mean, this is certainly lacking a lot of vegetation and you know, has a few other issues. But when he was looking at the effects of urbanisation, he suggests those point source inputs are not a good thing. If they're diffuse and our catchment is able to filter out some of those nutrients, sediments and contaminants, it certainly helps maintain the water quality condition. So what can we do about that? Well, we can be conscious about it and be aware of it. Rain gardens and other water sensitive urban designs. So this is being used more and more nowadays. And again, rather than having a concrete drain going straight down your waterway, we can build rain gardens to trap some of this water, treat that water, filter out sediments, etc., before it gets to our local waterways. This one, I just wanted to throw, this is my new, love this one. This is biodiversity sensitive urban design. This was coined by RMIT. Us at GHD did some work along with them as well. What this is all about is, I had that picture earlier about the urban development where they were revegetating the banks rather than having a concrete drain. This is trying to take it a step further and say, well, rather than just revegetate and plant trees, identify the species you want to target, whether it's a bird species, whether it's platypus or fish, then work out what their habitat and ecological requirements are, and then incorporate that into your design. So we end up with an urban environment that is in some ways providing some benefits to our species. And again, Sassafras Creek, overall, pretty good condition. I put an asterisk there because none of our waterways are pristine. Every one of us influences the health of our waterways. Just having a roof on our head captures rain and changes the way that water flows. The roads change, you know, the flow paths. We can't help but have some of our, you know, rubbish and nutrients, etc., end up in waterways. But it is relatively good, largely unregulated. The rainforest, the native vegetation in the area is what is helping to maintain some of that waterway function. You know, we've got our algae growing, which is important to headwater streams, and everything else is following on after that. And I think that's where I got to.
Thank you, Peter. Fascinating, fabulous to think about the connections between the litter and the algae and then all those higher order life forms. It's something that certainly got me thinking. So that's been a good job. I wonder if anyone's got questions, if you can pop them in to the chat. I was interested, Peter, in your comment on the gambusia. That's one fish that thankfully I've never seen in Sassy Creek. Lots of galaxias, lots of trout, almost all brown trout, but gambusia so far have not actually been there as far as I've seen, which is a bit of a miracle. Oh, Helen's just pointed out that I might get you to stop sharing screen so that we can see everyone's faces a bit easier.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yeah, on the Gambusia, they do prefer the slower flowing waterways rather than fast flowing. So they might not make their way up into those upper reaches of Sassafras Creek, but it's worth being aware that they're out there. The weatherlights do like some of the faster flowing areas, and they love boulders to live under. So maybe it's only a matter of time until some of these species get up that way.
The other thing that I was wondering about with the trout, I've never actually seen a blackfish in above sort of Beagley's Bridge or even down below Beagley's Bridge. I've been out at night many times spotlighting, catching trout out and things, and you see the galaxias, but I wonder whether the trout might be causing issues out competing the river blackfish. Is that likely the story?
That's a good question. We did some work in the Upper Yarra River, right below the Upper Yarra Reservoir, where we needed to do fish surveys, and we found hundreds of blackfish and one brown trout. And there was a chance that, I don't know if you're aware of the Little and Big Peninsula tunnels on the Yarra River.
Oh, yeah.
Anyway, there was a chance that there was a barrier to trout in those upper reaches, and that's why the blackfish were flourishing. There was other reaches we surveyed where there wasn't a barrier, and there was more trout, and there was less blackfish. So I don't know the answer, and I also don't know where in Sassafras Creek they are. When you do the VBA search, the Victorian Biodiversity Atlas search, you need to put a minimum buffer on the site that you're looking at, and that might be 1 or 2 kilometres. It came up in the results, so I put it in the list. The other thing that I could check, it might have been 1914 when that record of the black trout was recorded.
Well, I was speaking to an ecologist a few months ago that said he, as a child, remembers, he was telling me he thought he'd seen river blackfish around Kay's picnic ground. So that was probably, 25, 30 years ago. So I don't know if it's a recent thing.
And I don't know where that weir is and if that acts as a barrier to blackfish getting further upstream from there. Based on the habitat.
Upstream, the trout are upstream of the weir, so they get up it.
Okay. Yeah. It wouldn't surprise me if they are there. There's no reason they shouldn't be. But yeah, there are some areas where blackfish aren't found now, whereas they were in the past.
Alex, Garrick Purgle, Southern Dandenongs Community Nursery. I'm wondering about what interest there might be and what capacity Peter might have for a possibility of a bit of a walk, talk and gawk, if you like, over some sections of the creek to possibly reinforce some of those principles that he's articulated, and just in a sense of perhaps it might engender perhaps a wider range of questions from participants. So I don't know whether Peter's may be able to do that, whether the project team's interested in doing that, and what interest there might be in that potential for a bit of a look at the site, some sites along the creek.
Well, fortunately, Garrick, Peter did mention yesterday when we tested our Zoom link that he might come out and do a little bit of even electrofishing, which I think would be very exciting. So I think Bill might have more to say on that too. But
thanks, Alex.
Like a great idea.
Yeah, I'd be more than happy to do that. I thank you all for putting all your efforts in what you do in these groups. I think that's just great. And if I can help out in any way, I've tried to start helping out at the nursery with Garrick and others, but would be more than happy. Ideally, we'd be able to, the EPA has a standard protocol for monitoring waterways. including water quality and collecting the invertebrates. So ideally, we could run through that process and do the proper assessment on the current health of the creek. We could potentially do electrofishing, but there might be some permit issues associated with that. So permits for work, for research purposes. I have looked into it and had mixed responses as to whether that's a yay or a nay. And I might have to chase up a second colleague of mine for the safety side of things as well. Ideally, it'd be great. I'd love to get up there and see what's there.
I mean, look,
conversation going.
Oh, look, Alex, and I would support that opportunity. Perhaps, if it can be, perhaps add to perhaps a baseline condition that perhaps the group could be involved with subsequently, and possibly in association with Peter, if you like, just to giving and therefore giving a basis for determination of trends in what's happening with those elements of the assessment. So look, look, that's an exciting prospect.
And I'd also offer, sorry, Jane, just quickly.
I was just going to say that there has been a Water Watch group, and I think Jenny Stroh was in that group. They haven't met for a long time because of COVID, but they would meet there sort of, I think, did the 10 surveys a year. So that survey work has been done just at Beagley's Bridge.
Yeah, and I spoke with the Water Watch coordinator at Melbourne Water during the week. I was aware there was some stuff going on. I couldn't find the data online, but yeah, I'm sure. And that's great that they do that. That's a great way to.
I'm not quite sure when and if it's going to resume, but it has been happening over the years.
Can I say, Alex, that given that the project has sought to engage with various local schools, that if an event that Peter is talking about can be held, I'm wondering about the feasibility of possibly each of the schools who have sought to be involved with the project to possibly nominate 1 or 2 students that could possibly be present at such an on-site event.
Yeah, sounds like a good idea.
I think we need to engage the next generation.
Absolutely. Well, hopefully with all these loosening restrictions, we'll have that opportunity to actually all get out there.
I was going to say, now that I'm in the circle of trust, in the future, if you've got any questions on waterways, waterway health, works, even the legislation that it needs to be followed associated with waterways, feel free to reach out. And as I said, I'm no expert. We use the term specialist, but it is the trade I'm involved with. So I might be able to assist in other ways as well, and happy to.
How much use is Water Watch? So I think you've sort of covered off on that in your response to the earlier questions, that you think it is very, very worthwhile by the sound of it for that to keep going at Beagley's Bridge. Yeah,
well, I guess there's 2 parts to Water Watch. Yes, it's great. It's designed as that school kids can do it. So it's citizen science, which certainly has a place and provides some good information. If myself or some colleagues were out there, we might be able to take it just that next step further. But it's also great because it gets kids enthused.
You've offered to answer all my questions. It's just
yeah. Well, if I can answer them, as I said, some of you guys have just got way more knowledge on the creek and other aspects of it that I'm not even aware of. But as a team, yeah, we can solve anything.
That's great. Well, thank you, everyone, and thank you, Peter. And we'll speak more on a field day sometime soon, hopefully.